Life of Sophia Dorothea, the wife to George I. George I, unlike the infamous Henry VIII, didn't marry again, but started the Hanoverian dynasty. His son became George II, and his wife turned out to be the direct ancestor of all future British kings. In 1664, Eleanor de Olbreus met George William. He fell for her right away, leading her to move to Germany, where she was named the Lady of Harburg. 2 years later, in September 1666, their daughter was born. She was considered illegitimate and had a tough start in her life. Despite reaching adulthood, her life didn't get any better. She ended up spending most of it in prison. Let's dive into the 17th century mystery of Sophia Dorothea. As a child, Sophia Dorothea enjoyed a relaxed and loving home life. Her father gave her a large inheritance to improve her chances of a good marriage. Little is known about her early years, but in 1674, when she was 8, she was officially recognised and named Duchess of Wilhelmsburg as an only child and no threat to the Duke. In 1676, Eleanor and George finally married. Soon, a Danish prince and the nearby Duke of Brunswick showed interest in marrying Sophia Dorothea, but these plans fell through. A more serious proposal came later, but in the end, her father thought she'd be happier marrying her first cousin, George Louis of Hanover. George William worked on securing the Lunenburg dukedom, and his initial plan was for Sophia to marry Ernest Augustus, Elector of Brunswick-Lunenburg, whose eldest son, George Louis, would become King George I of Great Britain. Given Sophia Dorothea's controversial birth, his brother and sister-in-law were reluctant to support the marriage. Her parents didn't do much to make her appealing to her future in-laws, but she brought a significant dowry that was much needed in Hanover. There was a famous story about her childhood. Her parents made her sleep in their bed after they discovered love letters that she was hiding. Another story tells of her reaction to her arranged marriage. She threw a diamond-covered miniature of George Louis against the wall and declared that her parents would have to drag her to the wedding. Some might say it's understandable to be upset, especially with George Louis not exactly being the ideal husband. Back when he was just 16, he scandalously got his parents' governess pregnant. He was also known for being cold and unfriendly. There were suggestions that he should marry his cousin Anne Stuart, the daughter of James, Duke of York, who was next in line to the childless Charles II. But instead he married Sophia Dorothea on the 21st of November, 1682, when he was 22 and she was just 16. It was clear right from the beginning that this marriage wouldn't work. George Louis's mother disliked Sophia Dorothea, thinking that she wasn't good enough for their family. George himself was harsh and often scolded his wife, leading to arguments every time they spoke. Despite their unhappy marriage, they did have 2 children, George Augustus, born on the 30th of October 1683, who would later become King George II, and Sophia Dorothea, born on the 16th of March 1687, who would become a future queen in Prussia and electress in Brandenburg. After the children were born, George felt his duties as a husband were over. He took a mistress and continued to mistreat his wife. But he couldn't just leave her because he would lose a huge sum of money, £100,000 in cash from her dowry and inheritance if they divorced. His parents stepped in, asking him to keep his affair low-key. When Sophia Dorothea found out about the affair, she confronted him about how wrong his actions were. Over the next 5 years, the relationship was filled with growing dislike and resentment. This made Sophia very unhappy. During this time, the mistress had 2 daughters with George, Anna Louise in January 1692, Petronella in 1693. Meanwhile, Sophia didn't have any more children, suggesting the couple had effectively separated. What happened next isn't entirely clear, but most people believe that in 1690, Sophia Dorothea started exchanging letters with a Swedish colonel in the Hanoverian army. Sophia Dorothea and the Count would send their letters to his sister twice a year to keep them safe from nosy people. However, some of these letters were found by their descendants, and it's believed that Sophia's son destroyed many of them to protect their privacy. The letters indicate they may have started a romantic relationship in March 1692, right after George's illegitimate daughter was born, though it's unclear if Sophia knew about the child. They tried to keep their relationship secret, but soon people started talking. Sophia's mother and mother-in-law tried to get her to end the affair, worried about her already troubled marriage. Her sister-in-law was less understanding, and in 1694, during a walk in the gardens, Sophia stumbled upon a small building where she caught her husband with his mistress and their daughter. This led to a fierce argument, where George even tried to strangle her. Sophia hoped for support from her in-laws, but they coldly advised her to overlook her husband's actions and not react. Frustrated and desperate, Sophia began planning to escape with her count. Since George controlled all of her money from her dowry, she asked her parents for financial help, but they said that they had no funds to give. The marriage seemed beyond repair, and George even considered discussing a legal separation with his father. On the evening of the 1st of July 1694, the Count was seen at Sophia's home. That night, Ernest Augusta's mistress, the Countess von Platen, who disliked Sophia, tricked him with a message and later boasted to Ernest Augusta about capturing the couple. After getting his reluctant approval, she locked the doors of Sophia's apartment. When the Count tried to leave, von Platen and her allies attacked him in the apartment and killed him. Von Platen explained the situation to Ernest Augustus, who hadn't authorized a murder. To cover up the crime, Ernest had the Count's body hidden in the palace walls, covered up with quicklime. Sophia Dorothea, located far from the scene, heard nothing. The next day she was confined to her room by court order. The official stance was that the Count had disappeared voluntarily, and calls for an investigation were ignored, yet many suspected murder. Meanwhile, George, Ernest Augustus and George Louis started legal proceedings to divorce Sophia. They used their supposed refusal to live with George Louis as an excuse, unrelated to any infidelity. She was moved from Hanover to the castle in Celle, Auden. Officially, it was stated that she had tried to escape and was now under her parents' care, should anyone powerful ask about her situation. Throughout the divorce process, Sophia insisted that she had done nothing wrong, but the judge decided in her favour of her husband. Her father and father-in-law agreed that George Louis could keep her dowry for the benefit of their children and made sure that she couldn't leave Auden Castle. Sophia wasn't told about these decisions, and after her marriage officially ended on the 28th of December, she said goodbye to her children, not knowing she would never see them again. She thought moving to Auden might allow her more freedom to visit her parents, but she soon realised she was actually a prisoner there. Her mother visited often and asked for her release, but her father never came to see her. Legally, Louis could remarry as the innocent party, but he chose not to, and also stopped their children from contacting her. Sophia Dorothea ended up confined for life in the castle's north wing, guarded by a team of 40 men. At first she was only allowed in the mansion's courtyard, then later in the gardens with a guard, and after 2 years she could take short supervised walks. Conflicts and renovations at Auden sometimes forced her to stay at Celle Castle or Essel. She was served by a local entourage, including 2 ladies-in-waiting and various house and kitchen staff. Eventually released, she became known as the Duchess of Auden, but was emotionally detached from everything. In her letters, Sophia Dorothea expressed continued love for her ex-husband and pleaded for a chance to see her children. She also wrote to her former mother-in-law, wishing to meet her before she died. Neither George Louis nor Electress Sophia responded. Towards the end of his life in 1705, her father wanted to see her to make amends, but his minister advised against it, fearing diplomatic issues with Hanover, so the visit never happened. After her mother's death in 1722, Sophia Dorothea was alone. In 1725 she dressed up daily and waited by the window, hoping to see her daughter, the Queen of Prussia, who was visiting Hanover, but she never came. Sophia's later years were marred by health problems. She became significantly overweight, and her well-being was frequently undermined by febrile colds that left her shivering and miserable, along with persistent indigestion that made meals a source of discomfort rather than pleasure. Her physical ailments continued to worsen, culminating in early 1726 when she suffered a debilitating stroke. This marked the beginning of a steep decline in her health. By August of that year, Sophia's condition deteriorated further. She was struck by a severe bout of colic, a painful abdominal condition that confined her to her bed. Griped by intense pain, she became increasingly despondent and refused all forms of food and medical treatment. Her refusal to eat or seek help suggested a deep resignation to her fate, perhaps hastened by the cumulative toll of her illnesses and the isolation that she felt in her later years. Her life came to a quiet end just before midnight on the 13th of November, 1726, at the age of 60. Following her death, an autopsy was performed, which revealed the extent of her internal afflictions. The doctors discovered that she had succumbed to liver failure. Additionally, her gallbladder was obstructed, a condition compounded by the presence of 60 gallstones, a staggering number that underscored the severe underlying medical issues that she'd faced. Sophia Dorothea's death was noted with minimal fanfare. Her former husband, from whom she had been estranged for many years, placed a brief announcement in the London Gazette stating that the Duchess of Ahlden had passed away. Notably, he expressly forbade any public displays of mourning in both London and Hanover, reflecting the continued estrangement and possibly unresolved bitterness between them. His disdain for any form of mourning was further evidenced by his reaction to the news that members of his daughter's court in Berlin had donned black attire in mourning. Reports indicate that he was incensed upon hearing this, although his reasons remained rooted in the complexities of their personal and political histories. In the immediate aftermath of her death, the guards of Ahlden were tasked with handling her remains. They placed her body in a lead coffin and temporarily stored it in a cellar, a stark and somewhat unbefitting resting place for a woman of her station. The initial plan was for a quiet interment in the local cemetery of Ahlden. However, this plan was thwarted by weeks of relentless heavy rain that rendered the cemetery inaccessible. As a result, her coffin was returned to the cellar and hastily covered with sand, a provisional measure that underscored the somewhat chaotic and undignified handling of her burial. It was not until May 1727, several months after her death, that conditions finally allowed for Sophia to be buried. The delayed burial took place without any ceremony, quietly, and without mourning typically afforded to individuals of her rank. The austere and almost forgotten conclusion to her life stands in stark contrast to the complexities and intrigues that had marked her earlier years as a consort caught in the turbulent cross-currents of European nobility. Her final resting place, devoid of pomp or significant recognition, perhaps epitomizes the isolation and neglect that she experienced in her final years, far removed from the power and influence that she once defied her life. Crafty insights about Queen Caroline of Ansbach, the astute matriarch of history. Queen Caroline of Ansbach was a commanding figure in British history, wielding influence that surpassed expectations with her exceptional intelligence. Born into a German noble family amid adversity, her life's journey took her from the courts of Prussia to the regal palaces of Britain, setting the stage for one of history's most intriguing and ruthless family rivalries. Queen Caroline of Ansbach, a commanding presence as the consort of Britain, wielded her power for beyond expectations. Her intelligence surpassed not only her royal spouse, King George II, but also most individuals. Caroline was a mastermind who devised intricate plots, often targeting those within her own family. Join us to discover one of history's most ruthless family rivalries. Caroline's tumultuous family background may have contributed to her complex interpersonal relationships. Born in 1683 into a German noble clan, she faced early adversity. Her father succumbed to smallpox when she was just 3 years old, and her mother passed away when she was 13, leaving her an orphan. Nonetheless, fate had great plans for her. Alone and vulnerable, Caroline found herself in the court of the King and Queen of Prussia, primarily due to her mother's friendship with Queen Sophia of Prussia. Sophia welcomed her as a ward and soon discovered Caroline's exceptional intellect, curiosity, and emerging beauty. This set the stage for a significant turning point in her life. Caroline's aristocratic lineage, captivating beauty, and sharp intellect led her surrogate mother, Queen Sophia, to hail her as the most agreeable princess in Germany. It didn't take long for Queen Sophia to consider a marriage proposal to the future Holy Roman Emperor. However, Caroline's response was nothing short of shocking. In 1705, Caroline faced yet another monumental trial in her young life. That year, her beloved Queen Sophia tragically succumbed to pneumonia at the mere age of 36. The news left Caroline in a deep state of mourning, and she confided to a friend, "The calamity has overwhelmed me with grief and sickness, and it is only the hope that I may soon follow her that consoles me." However, fate had a different path in store for her. Although Queen Sophia had departed, her memory lingered. In June, Prince George Augustus of the House of Hanover, Queen Sophia's nephew, paid a peculiar visit to Caroline's court. Strangely, he arrived in disguise, and his motives went beyond mere amusement. Prince George had a serious mission to court Caroline and secure an heir. Nevertheless, his family's history and marriage matters were plagued by turmoil. The House of Hanover was notorious for internal conflicts, and his father's marriage to Sophia Dorothea of Celle had ended in tragedy. It was rumoured that the patriarch had murdered his wife's lover and imprisoned her for decades, separating her from her children. George saw it essential to investigate Caroline as a potential bride, but he couldn't have foreseen how this would backfire. George's infatuation with Caroline was evident from the outset. He had heard rumours of her incomparable beauty and mental attributes, but her actual qualities exceeded his wildest expectations. He couldn't divert his attention from her. However, Caroline, with her keen perception, recognised his true identity from the beginning. Fortunately for George, she found him appealing and eventually agreed to marry him. Nevertheless, she might have had her own hidden agenda. George's family had firmly established himself in the realm of dysfunction, as evidenced by his mother's imprisonment and estrangement. Yet there was one distinct advantage they possessed. They were next in line for the British throne. While Queen Anne, their distant cousin, currently reigned, her health was fragile, and she had no heirs. Thus the sceptre was on its way to George's father, and eventually George himself. When Caroline agreed to marry George, it's difficult not to speculate that she might have had aspirations for the crown, although she had no inkling of the challenges that lay ahead. Shortly after the wedding and a modest ceremony in George's homeland of Hanover, Caroline faced immense pressure. Her in-laws were adamant about the urgent need for a male heir. In fact, George's father went so far as to ban him from participating in military campaigns until Caroline was expecting, and the expectation was that their child would be a boy. This was the cost of marrying into a soon-to-be royal lineage, but Caroline had a knack for coming out on top, as she consistently did. Defying societal norms for their era, George and Caroline were deeply in love and had no trouble fulfilling their marital obligations. Consequently, Caroline became pregnant almost immediately, and she gave birth to a son, Frederick, in January 1707. However, what might have been considered a fortunate turn of events in other circumstances became a tumultuous beginning for Caroline. Shortly after childbirth, Caroline was struck down by smallpox and subsequent to pneumonia, teetering on the brink of death. The palace took precautions to keep her newborn son away from her to prevent potential infection, while George, devoted to his wife, remained at her side to nurse her back to health, even contracting smallpox himself. Fortunately, both survived, but it was only the start of a tumultuous journey with little Prince Frederick, and speaking of tumultuous. Although George's love for Caroline led him to endure smallpox for her sake, he did not restrain himself to a monogamous relationship. Much like many nobles of the time, George maintained multiple mistresses alongside his marital obligations with Caroline. It was evident because she gave birth to 3 more children, all girls, in less than a decade. However, there's an intriguing twist to the extramarital situation. Caroline of Ansbach was undeniably astute. She knew how to manage her husband's wandering eye. Rather than confronting it, she chose to embrace it, and even encouraged George to discuss his mistresses with her. This way she remained in the loop rather than being kept in the dark. Furthermore, she often employed these women as her ladies-in-waiting, giving her a watchful eye on their activities. Caroline brought stability to George's historically turbulent household, but she was about to face some challenging years. In 1714, Queen Anne of Great Britain passed away, and Caroline's father-in-law ascended to the English throne as King George I, with Caroline and her husband becoming the Prince and Princess of Wales. Consequently, Caroline embarked on a sea voyage to England to personally assume her new titles and adapt to royal life. However, there was something she had left behind at home. Queen Caroline Part 2. Upon relocating to England and taking on their new roles, Caroline and George made the heart-wrenching decision to leave their 7-year-old son, Prince Frederick, in the care of his uncle in Germany. Upon their relocation to England and their new roles, Caroline and George brought most of their daughters with them, opting to leave their 7-year-old son, Prince Frederick, in the care of his uncle back in Germany. Perhaps this decision appeared reasonable at the time, but it would be a grueling 14 years before they would reunite with him, among other complications. Caroline, however, was not one to dwell in sentimentality. Instead, she quickly became entangled in British intrigue. Caroline's move to England as Princess of Wales ushered in a significant shift in her life. Since there was no Queen Consort, recall that the King of England had his former wife locked away in Germany, Caroline now held the highest ranking position among women in the realm. The newfound power seemed to go to her head. While the royal family is expected to present a unified front to their subjects, harmonising a group of entitled nobles is no straightforward task. Caroline wasted no time in causing a stir within weeks of her arrival. While King George I was staunchly German, Caroline and her husband were determined to Anglise themselves, rapidly immersing themselves in British politics, culture and social circles. Regrettably, this did not bode well. Their immersion into British culture, seemingly innocent and benevolent, was in fact a calculated move. They appeared significantly more modern and approachable compared to the austere king, and their popularity soared, likely as Caroline had intended all along. They soon created a full-fledged rival court in direct opposition to the monarch, which greatly displeased King George. The historical House of Hanover dysfunction reared its head again, and tensions escalated to a breaking point. When that breaking point arrived, it was tragic. Amidst these political manoeuvres, Caroline became pregnant once more, but this time the outcome was far from favourable. Following 4 successful pregnancies, she tragically delivered a stillborn son. Those close to her attributed the tragedy to the incompetence of English physicians, and the brewing bitterness within the royal court likely exacerbated matters. Caroline was undoubtedly devastated, yet little did she know that the situation was about to take a nightmarish turn. In 1717, a year after the stillbirth, Caroline gave birth to a healthy boy, Prince George William. Overjoyed at her successful pregnancy, Caroline eagerly prepared for the boy's baptism. However, here she made a rare miscalculation. She had not considered that the royal court was a tinderbox ready to ignite, and it was about to explode in her face. On the day of George William's baptism, King George I, who had likely been waiting the opportunity to retaliate, suddenly took issue with his son and daughter-in-law's choice of godparents. His revenge was merciless. Rather than discussing the matter with them, the king confined Caroline and her husband to the house arrest at St. James's Palace and then banished them from the court entirely. In the aftermath of the baptism controversy, King George I forcibly separated Caroline and her husband from their children, including the newborn, insisting that the infants remain with him while the couple endured exile. It was a cruel punishment designed to underscore who truly held the sceptre and power in Britain, but this time the king had gone too far. During this period of separation, Caroline's worry for her children consumed her, driving her to such a state of distress that she secretly entered the king's palace to visit them. Eventually, King George I couldn't ignore her actions and felt guilty for the anguish that he was causing. He granted her unrestricted access to their infants, but by then the damage had been done. In February 1718, Caroline faced her worst nightmare when her youngest son, Prince George William, fell gravely ill and passed away at just a few months old. The palace even conducted an autopsy to ensure that the separation from his mother hadn't caused his death, and it revealed that he had a heart polyp. However, whatever the cause of his death, it did nothing to improve King George I's popularity or mend his relationship with his son and Caroline. Unfortunately, the hardships continued. Caroline's nerves were undoubtedly shredded to the core by now. In the same year her infant son passed, she suffered a miscarriage due to the shock of a storm while she was at home. The Princess of Wales mourned the loss of her third child, and although she would go on to have 3 more healthy children, she never forgot that King George I was a co-author of her misfortunes. Faced with these challenges, she concocted a ruthless plot, one that would ultimately fail. Caroline was too intelligent to openly declare hostilities with her father-in-law. Instead, she cultivated a friendship with the politician Robert Walpole, seeking to wield real power behind the scenes in the government. For a brief period, it seemed to work. Walpole even orchestrated a public reconciliation with the crown for Caroline and her husband, a mere show of unity to gain more influence and hopefully regain her children from the king. However, things did not unfold as she had hoped. Accustomed to meticulously managing her household and affairs, Caroline learned a painful lesson about her own fallibility through her alliance with Walpole. Unbeknownst to her, Walpole was using her to advance his own political influence. While her efforts to regain custody of her children stalled, Walpole ascended to the de facto Prime Minister of Britain. Empty-handed and frustrated, Caroline needed to find another means to seek vengeance. Ultimately, it came in the most natural way possible. In 1727, Caroline received news that likely brought her immense satisfaction. King George I had been travelling when he suffered a stroke on the road. Although he clung to life for another day or so, King George I of England, and a perpetual thorn in Caroline's side, passed away on the 11th of June 1727. At last, she became the Queen Consort, and her husband ascended to the throne as King George II of Britain. One of her initial acts was to reunite her family, but this act opened Pandora's box that she never could close. Caroline regained custody of her children, whom King George I had kept away from her. However, she still had to summon her son, Prince Frederick, who had spent the last decade and a half in Germany. As a grown man, Frederick joined the family in England as the new Prince of Wales in 1728. Yet this union was far from joyous. When Caroline laid eyes on her son again, it marked the beginning of troubles. In the years since Caroline had last seen her son, Prince Frederick, he had undergone a troubling transformation. He had become a debauched person, indulging in drinking, gambling, and maintaining several mistresses. Yet the most alarming aspect was not his behaviour. Frederick harboured a deep resentment for his absent parents, and perhaps as a karmic twist related to Caroline's own actions as the Princess of Wales, he swiftly aligned himself with her political adversaries, if only it had ended there. Over the years, Caroline's political astuteness remained as sharp as ever. She even urged her husband to maintain their complicated relationship with Robert Walpole, recognising his substantial influence and desiring to remain in his favour. Starting in 1728, this political acumen paid off handsomely. During King George II's absence, it was Caroline who acted as regent, not her wayward son. Yes, only Caroline of Ansbach could devise a way to solidify her influence and simultaneously slight her son. However, it was a decision that would soon backfire. In 1736, King George II was once again away, and Caroline was serving as regent. This time, things took a disastrous turn. A detractor of the king and queen posted a note at the royal palace gate, and it read, "Lost or strayed out of this house, a man who has left a wife and 6 children." It marked one of the first signs of unrest against Caroline's sway over George, and the situation was on the verge of escalating dramatically. When King George II finally attempted to return his post in England several months later, a series of misfortune nearly spelled catastrophe. First, his ship encountered a storm, leading to rumours in London that the king had perished. Upon his return, matters only worsened as he collapsed into illness upon reaching his bed. Caroline must have been riddled with anxiety, but her son Frederick saw it as a ruthless opportunity. While Frederick inherited his mother's disdain for the older generation, he had none of her political finesse. Everything he did was grandiose and brash. For instance, Frederick rapidly propagated another rumour that the king had truly passed away, prompting King George II to rise from his feverish haze and prove that he was still alive. At this juncture, Caroline and George recognised that they needed to address their troublesome son. However, their solution would prove to be calamitous. Possibly hoping that marriage would temper her son's behaviour, Caroline had wed Frederick to 16-year-old Princess Augusta of Saxe-Gotha just before the shipwreck debacle. Yet this union did not quell his rebelliousness. It merely provided him with a new pawn to employ in his efforts to antagonize his parents. At one point, he instructed the naive Augusta to arrive at the chapel after Queen Caroline, forcing her to rudely nudge the consort aside to claim her seat. It was a petty irritation Frederick took great pleasure in. However, his next move would propel this feud to ludicrous extremes. When Frederick's new wife became pregnant, he devised another scheme to exact revenge on his mother and father. As soon as he learned of Augusta's labour, he initiated a ruthless plot. He compelled the princess to undertake a nocturnal journey to a remote palace for the birth of their baby daughter, on a tablecloth, no less, as the palace was unprepared to receive her. Why did he do this? To ensure that his parents would not be present for the birth of their grandchild. When Caroline discovered this, her response was unrelenting. Caroline was no stranger to the realm of familial discord, and despite her horror at Frederick's actions, she managed to deliver a scathing insult of her own. You see, royal births typically had numerous witnesses, primarily to ensure the legitimacy of the child, especially if it was a boy and not some sort of changeling. Upon learning that it was a baby girl, Caroline breathed a sigh of relief and commented that it was a poor, ugly little she-mouse, rather than a large, fat, healthy boy. However, her response didn't end with words alone. Attempting to exclude one's royal parents from the line of succession is not advisable, and Caroline and King George II ensured that their son faced severe consequences for his actions. They exiled him from their court, mirroring the same actions taken against them by the previous king. Consequently, parents and son were officially estranged from one another. Remarkably, despite all the preceding tension, the situation managed to become even more awkward. Frederick grew up without a mother's influence, so perhaps he can be forgiven for not fully comprehending the extent of her vindictiveness. Over time, Caroline and George not only openly favoured their younger son, Prince William, but also explored methods to divide the inheritance in a way that would minimise Frederick's share of their holdings. Around this period, Caroline uttered statements that could never be taken back. Caroline's deep-seated animosity towards her son was evident, and she did not hold back her caustic remarks. It is reported that she once expressed, "I wish the ground would open this moment and sink the monster to the lowest hole in hell," or when speaking of Frederick's long-suffering wife Augusta, "Poor creature, were she to spit in my face, I would only pity her for being under such a fool's direction, and wipe it off." Motherhood, particularly with a son like Frederick, clearly did not suit Caroline. It would also prove to be her downfall. In 1724, when Caroline gave birth to her final child, she experienced a significant umbilical hernia. More than a decade later, this condition resurfaced in the most dreadful way possible. Following a formal reception in the winter of 1737, Caroline was in excruciating pain and confined to her bed. Alarmingly, a portion of her intestine had protruded through the old hernia opening, putting her life at risk. This marked the beginning of a period of desperation. King George II's love for his wife remained unwavering, and he implored the royal physicians to undertake a series of treatments in hope of curing her. However, despite various medical procedures, purging and bloodletting, Caroline's suffering only intensified. Recognizing that her end was near, Queen Caroline decided to enact one of her final acts of vengeance. Throughout this period, Caroline's son, Frederick, desperately sought the chance to see his dying mother one last time. Her response was chilling. Directed by his wife, King George II forbid Frederick from visiting Caroline, although the Queen Consort later relented and sent a message indicating her forgiveness. That note likely carried a touch of passive aggression. But soon her demeanour turned downright aggressive. Caroline's last moments on earth were marked by excruciating pain. Her strangulated bowel ruptured on the 17th of November 1737, and she writhed in agony for 4 more days before passing away on the 20th, at the age of 54. Yet there was a parting victory. As attendants prepared to lay her to rest in Westminster Abbey, she remained certain that her son Frederick was not invited to the funeral. Amid her painful demise, Caroline received the love of her husband. King George II reportedly wept by her bedside as she slipped away. When she urged him to remarry after her passing, he protested, stating, "No, I shall have mistresses," to which she retorted, "My God, that doesn't prevent it." When King George II followed her in death 23 years later, he was laid to rest in a matching coffin beside her. Not all of her relationships found such closure. In the end, all of Caroline's conflicts with her son, Prince Frederick, came to naught. Not only had she passed into history, but Frederick did not live long enough to ascend to the British throne. In 1751, at the age of 44, he likely succumbed to a pulmonary embolism, leaving his son, Caroline's grandson, to become King George III instead. Caroline's intellect and curiosity made her one of the most captivating women of her era, and she found herself at the forefront of many 18th century debates and advancements. She corresponded with the renowned philosopher Gottfried Leibniz and held salons for writers like Jonathan Swift. However, her most enduring intellect legacy had a darker side. During that period, medical practitioners were exploring new methods for inoculating against deadly diseases like smallpox, the very ailment that claimed Caroline's father. Caroline supported this research by initially testing the potentially perilous inoculation on condemned prisoners and subsequently using it on her own children, including Frederick. Did it prove effective? Yes. Does it offer some insight into Caroline's parenting approach? Just a bit. Caroline's political and emotional sway over King George II, as well as her role in the family feuds, constitutes her enduring legacy. Her influence was widely recognised during her time, and an uncomplimentary poem remarked, "You may strut dapper George, but 'twill all in vain. We all know 'tis Queen Caroline, not you that reign. Then if you would have us fall down and adore you, lock up your fat spouse as your dad did before you." Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, the Queen Consort of Great Britain and Ireland, rose from humble origins as a minor German country gentry to her esteemed position. Alongside King George III, she shared a happy marriage and a remarkable parenthood, blessed with an astonishing brood of 15 children. While her husband faced the loss of the American Revolution and the sorrow of her dear friend Marie Antoinette's demise in the French Revolution, Charlotte herself stayed away from political matters. Nonetheless, she made significant cultural contributions, introducing the Christmas tree to Britain. As the years advanced, she witnessed her cherished husband's descent into mental illness, while her children grappled with the challenges of securing a new generation of royals. Born Sophia Charlotte on the 19th of May 1744, she was the 8th child out of 10, born to Duke Charles Louis Frederick of Mecklenburg and Princess Elizabeth Albertine. Charles, the second son of the ruling Duke of Mecklenburg, hailed from a small duchy in northern Germany, part of the Holy Roman Empire at that time. Her upbringing primarily revolved around household management, preparing her for the expected role of a minor German prince's wife. Charlotte's life took a dramatic turn when her brother ascended to become the new Duke of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. The family relocated to the town of Neustrelitz, where Charlotte was exposed to courtly life, art, and music. Her mother formed an alliance with King George II of Great Britain, as Mecklenburg shared a border with George's hereditary Duchy of Hanover. The two German families had numerous connections, with Charlotte's mother being the second cousin of Augusta of Saxe-Gotha, the British king's daughter-in-law and soon-to-be mother of King George III. At the age of 22, George III initially fell in love with Lady Sarah Lennox. However, his advisers discouraged him from marrying an English aristocrat. Instead, his mother urged him to consider a match within their own family. Princess Charlotte, George's third cousin, captured his attention. Charlotte's appeal to George extended beyond her physical appearance, and her upbringing in an insignificant German duchy meant that she had little exposure to politics and intrigue. The king publicly declared his intention to marry Charlotte and dispatched counsellors to bring her from Mecklenburg to the UK. The British lords negotiated and finalised the marriage contract, leading to 3 days of joyful celebrations before Charlotte bid farewell to her homeland forever. The journey to London proved arduous, lasting 2 months. When Charlotte finally arrived, she was plagued by seasickness and bloated from the storms at sea. The bridal party landed on the coast and hastened their way to London, eventually reaching St James's Palace. There at the garden gate at 3:30 p.m, Charlotte met her groom and his family for the first time. After a brief respite, the couple married in a small ceremony held in the Royal Chapel at 9 p.m. on the same day. Just 2 weeks later, the newlywed king and queen were jointly crowned in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The youthful pair quickly gained immense popularity, and on their way to the opera, an exuberant crowd yearned for a glimpse of them in their carriage, resulting in a tragic incident where 4 people were crushed to death. While Charlotte didn't speak English fluently, her groom was well versed in German, enabling them to communicate effectively. Mindful of her mother's struggles to maintain control over Mecklenburg, the king advised Charlotte against meddling in political affairs, to which she displayed little interest. The couple developed a strong and affectionate bond, with George remaining faithful. George embodied a down-to-earth nature and earned the moniker Farmer George. He had little affinity for ostentation and courtly scheming, preferring a simple existence rooted in domestic comforts. Frugality, plain cuisine, and temperance. Charlotte, having been raised in a similar manner, found the alignment of values agreeable. Her vivacious and sociable disposition complemented his introspective shyness, and though she quickly acquired proficiency in English, her speech bore a notable accent. Observers noted her initial timidity, yet she became quite confident among familiar faces, relishing in delightful gossip. 11 months after their nuptials and 3 months following her 18th birthday, Charlotte gave birth to their first child, George, the Prince of Wales, who would eventually ascend to the throne as George IV. Subsequently, she brought forth a total of 15 offspring, comprising 9 sons and 6 daughters. Among them were Frederick William, destined to succeed his brother as William IV, Charlotte, who married the King of Württemberg, Edward, father to Queen Victoria, Augusta Elizabeth, who became the Landgravine of Hesse-Homburg, Ernest Augusta, who later became King of Hanover, Augustus Frederick Adolphus, Mary Sophia, Octavius, Alfred, and Amelia. Charlotte's final child entered the world when she was 39 years old, with a considerable age gap between Prince George and Princess Amelia. The Queen frequently lamented her perpetual state of pregnancy, expressing, "I cannot imagine a prisoner longing more ardently for freedom than I do for relief and the conclusion of my campaign. It would bring me joy to know that it was the final time." Nevertheless, she harboured immense love for her children, and tragically 2 of her sons, Alfred II and Octavius IV, succumbed to smallpox. However, the rest of her children survived to adulthood, except for Amelia, who tragically fell victim to tuberculosis at the age of 27. Unlike many royalty, King George and Queen Charlotte maintained a deeply involved role in their children's lives. George delighted in frolicking on the floor and engaging in games with his brood in the garden. Charlotte, while more formal and strict, displayed affectionate care towards her offspring. Education held paramount importance to her, employing tutors for her sons as expected of princes, but distinctively appointing well-educated governesses to educate her daughters. Charlotte's relationship with her mother-in-law Augusta remained strained. Augusta even paid spies among Charlotte's staff, enforcing rigid court protocols that hindered the Queen's ability to befriend British ladies. Consequently, Charlotte relied heavily on the companionship of her German entourage, and Augusta would then criticise Charlotte for her failure to assimilate into her new home. Within 4 years of their marriage, George experienced his first initial bout of mental illness, yet Augusta deliberately kept Charlotte uninformed about her husband's condition. Parliament passed a bill dictating that if the king became incapacitated, Charlotte would assume the role of regent. Augusta vehemently opposed this, desiring the regency for herself. As George's love for his wife and their growing brood intensified, Queen Charlotte's stature at court surged, eclipsing her mother-in-law's influence. Princess Augusta passed away at the age of 52, 11 years into her son's marriage. During their wedding, the official royal residence was St James's Palace, a creation of Henry VII, nestled in the heart of London. However, George and Charlotte preferred to reside in the suburban palaces of Kew and Windsor Castle. They embraced a laid-back lifestyle, often strolling through the gardens together without an entourage. Charlotte took a keen interest in developing the gardens at Kew. The Queen nurtured an ardent passion for botany, amassing a vast collection of plant species obtained by British explorers from all corners of the world. In her honour, the South African bird of paradise was named Strelitzia regine. Her fascination extended to the menagerie of exotic creatures as well. As a wedding gift, she received South African zebras and kept an elephant, kangaroos, and parrots. 2 Pomeranian dogs, Phoebe and Mercury, accompanied her from Germany, and she bestowed their offspring upon favoured courtiers, thus popularising the breed in Britain, her tradition continued by her granddaughter, Queen Victoria. To provide a more secluded haven for his beloved wife, George acquired Buckingham House, which Charlotte adored, and later became known as the Queen's House. Many of their children were born in there, and Charlotte left her mark by expanding and redecorating the interiors of Buckingham House and the Queen's Lodge at Windsor, embellishing them with vibrant colours and Indian paper. Her style was renowned for its dazzling charm and tastefulness, yet unfortunately none of her interior designers have survived. Later, her son George IV extensively altered Buckingham House, transforming it into the iconic Buckingham Palace that still serves as the official royal residence under Queen Victoria's reign and to this day. The royal couple embraced the novel concept of seaside holidays, thereby popularizing beach vacations. In 1768, the city of Charlotte, North Carolina, was named in honor of the British Queen, while the country in which it resides was named Mecklenburg. Often referred to as the Queen City, Charlotte boasts several statues commemorating Queen Charlotte's legacy. Her Majesty gained renown for her compassionate treatments of servants, displaying great kindness towards them. Deeply sympathetic to the plight of the poor, she decided to alleviate philanthropy as a new public face of the royal family, a tradition that still endures. She established an orphanage and a maternity hospital and organised charity balls to support her initiatives. On the 19th of May 1780, in celebration of her 38th birthday, George hosted a ball to raise funds for Chelsea Hospital. The event introduced a new tradition, the royal presentation of all unmarried noble ladies, and they were invited to be presented before Queen Charlotte in the drawing room at St James's Palace. This marked the inception of the London social season, a crucial milestone for aristocratic daughters in their pursuit of suitable matches. They donned exquisite court dresses adorned with colourful embroidered silk and wore 3 white ostrich feathers in their hair, evoking the fashion of the late 1700s, characterised by wide mantua hoop skirts. Queen Charlotte's commitment to tradition led to some unique fashion combinations, even when the empire silhouette featuring a high waist and slender collar skirt came into vogue in 1804. The Queen, with her love for the past, insisted on preserving the hoop skirts reminiscent of her youth. Known as an amateur matchmaker, Charlotte would suggest advantageous pairings for the women, providing insights into the latest gossip of London's upper class, referred to as the ton, in her letters to her husband and friends. Queen Charlotte's Ball became a prominent social event and continued until 1958, when Queen Elizabeth II decided to discontinue the ceremony. Nonetheless, the women's balls found their way to the United States, serving as a foundation for a more democratic alternative known as the high school prom. In the early 2000s, Queen Charlotte's Ball was revived in London, now featuring classes on business skills, networking, etiquette and philanthropy. The women still curtsy to a magnificent birthday cake, symbolising the memory of the illustrious Queen Charlotte. In 1800, Charlotte organised a Christmas ball at the Queen's Lodge that had a significant impact on British culture. She invited all the children of Windsor to attend and was surprised to see a decorated yew tree in the drawing room, which was the first English Christmas tree. This tradition was originally an ancient German pagan custom, but it was Christianized by Martin Luther in 1500s. Charlotte had already introduced this tradition to her own children, and every Christmas she would decorate a single yew branch with the help of her ladies-in-waiting. However, in 1800 she went all out and decorated the tree with sweetmeats, fruits, toys and small wax candles. The children were thrilled to receive a portion of these treats and toys, and this event popularised the tradition of decorating Christmas trees in Britain and its colonies. Charlotte had a wide range of interests, including playing cards, horseback riding, and singing while playing the harpsichord. She and George had a preference for German music, particularly the works of George Frederick Handel. To improve her musical skills, she hired Johann Christian Bach, the son of Johann Sebastian Bach, as her personal music teacher. Charlotte even hosted a young Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart at the palace, where he played complex arrangements and accompanied the Queen's singing of an aria. Mozart later dedicated his Opus 3 to her. Charlotte was hesitant to let her daughters marry, as she didn't want them to endure the pain of constant pregnancy and leave her side. Nevertheless, they became restless and longed to start their own lives, leading to a few of them having affairs with palace servants instead. Of her 6 daughters, only 3 got married, and one of them had a stillborn child. Charlotte's sons, on the other hand, were given more freedom, perhaps too much so. George the eldest was given his palace, Carlton House, at the age of 18, where he indulged in drinking and affairs with the mistresses. His annual allowance of £50,000 was insufficient to support his extravagant lifestyle, and he frequently had arguments with his parents. He secretly married to Catholic commoner Maria Fitzherbert, but his father refused to bail him out of debt unless he left Maria and married his first cousin, Caroline of Brunswick. The couple married the next day and had a child named Charlotte 9 months later, but they despised each other. The Queen was responsible for bringing up her granddaughter. Charlotte had a mild interest in politics and mainly focused on German affairs to help her brother. She may have influenced her husband to intervene in the War of Bavarian Succession, but asked her brother to destroy any letters related to politics to avoid offending her husband. Charlotte remained largely uninvolved in the tumultuous political events that unfolded during George III's reign. While he aimed to be an active ruler rather than a mere figurehead, George III campaigned and invested money in political candidates who would support his agenda. He successfully fragmented the political parties and appointed a compliant prime minister who would carry out his wishes. However, George did not anticipate being held responsible when things went awry. One of George's initiatives was his interest in agriculture and his desire to have more land owned and farmed by aristocrats. To accomplish this, he championed the Enclosures Act of 1773, which allowed the wealthy to seize and enclose a significant portion of the country's common land that had been shared and cultivated by communities for centuries. This had a profound impact, concentrating wealth in the hands of privileged few while impoverishing and starving the rest of the population. Another ill-fated decision was the imposition of the Stamp Act, a tax levied on the American colonies. The colonists were outraged, as they had their own local governments and taxation systems, and saw no reason to pay taxes to a distant government in which they had no representation. In 1776 they declared their independence from Britain, and George dispatched his army to suppress the rebellion. But after 5 years of warfare, the scrappy colonists emerged victorious over the formidable Redcoat army. With a need for a new penal colony, Britain turned its attention to the recently explored continent of Australia, establishing a settlement there in 1788. Meanwhile, in 1788, King George suffered another severe bout of mental illness. He exhibited symptoms such as incessant talking, foaming at the mouth, and rampaging through the palace. The exact nature of his illness remains unclear, whether it was porphyria, a hereditary blood disorder, or another condition like bipolar. Charlotte was frightened by her husband's outburst and requested to be moved to a separate bedroom. She and their daughters visited him daily, although these visits were fraught with tension. The king would often cling to them and engage in imaginary conversations with their deceased sons, Octavius and Alfred. Tensions also arose between Charlotte and her 26-year-old son, George, Prince of Wales. She suspected him of conspiring to have doctors declare the king insane so that he could assume the regency. Similarly, he suspected her of attempting to have her own doctors declare the king sane in order to establish herself as regent. Ultimately, Parliament appointed Prince George as regent, while naming Charlotte as the king's guardian. Charlotte maintained a correspondence with Queen Marie Antoinette of France for many years, although they never met in person. They bonded over their shared love of music and art. In 1789, the French Revolution erupted, leading to the imprisonment of Marie Antoinette, her husband Louis XV, and their children. Charlotte attempted to orchestrate a plot to rescue her friend and even prepared palace apartments for the French royals. She was devastated to learn of Louis and Marie Antoinette's subsequent execution by guillotine. In 1798, Ireland rebelled against British rule and was ultimately defeated. Parliament later enacted the 1800 Act of Union, officially incorporating Ireland into the renamed United Kingdom. George III's mental decline continued unabated, leaving him permanently trapped in a state of madness from which he would never recover. Witnessing her beloved spouse endure suffering was an incredibly arduous experience for Charlotte. She actively avoided encountering him, and her own demeanour underwent a transformation. Depression and a volatile temper became part of her character. Even activities she once relished, such as attending public events like concerts, no longer brought her joy. To alleviate her headache, she developed a dependency on snuff, a powdered tobacco substance snorted through the nose. Unfortunately, her relationship with her adult children became strained during this time, and amidst the difficulties, Charlotte discovered solace in the creative pursuit of designing the interiors and gardens of a newly constructed residence known as Frogmore House. From 1811 to 1820, the Prince of Wales assumed the role of Prince Regent, a period famously referred to as the Regency. As he was estranged from his wife Caroline, Charlotte acted as the de facto First Lady of the court, standing alongside him as a hostess. The prince, eager to have a purpose, engaged in frequent disputes with Parliament, and his extravagant lifestyle during the Napoleonic Wars, while the nation endured austerity measures, caused him to be despised by the public. The hopes of the Hanoverian dynasty rested on their only legitimate child, the beautiful and level-headed Princess Charlotte, and her handsome husband, Prince Leopold. Tragically, all those hopes were shattered when she passed away during childbirth at the tender age of 21. The entire nation mourned this heart-wrenching loss, and Queen Charlotte grieved deeply for her cherished granddaughter. The princess's untimely death proved to be a catastrophe for the Hanoverian dynasty, and despite having 12 adult children, George and Charlotte had no legitimate grandchildren to succeed the throne. While some of their sons had children with their mistresses, these offspring were ineligible for inheritance. Thus, there was a pressing need to avert a succession crisis. In response, Parliament offered monetary incentives to the princes if they would sever ties with their mistresses, marry foreign princesses, and produce a new generation of royal heirs. One pamphlet of the time humorously quipped, "Hot and hard, each royal pair are at it, hunting for the heir." The victor in this procreative race was Edward, Duke of Kent, the fourth son who would father the future Queen Victoria. Sadly, Queen Charlotte never had the opportunity to meet her granddaughter. She passed away on the 7th of November 1818 at the age of 74, only 6 months before Victoria's birth. Her son, Prince George, was by her side, holding her hand at the age of 74, merely 6 months before Victoria's birth, holding her hand during her final moments. Charlotte had served as Queen Consort for an impressive 57 years, the second longest tenure in British history, following only Prince Philip. King George III had deteriorated to such an extent that he was not informed of his wife's passing. He himself passed away a little over a year later, at the age of 81. He was laid to rest beside his beloved wife in the royal vault beneath St. George's Chapel in Windsor. In recent times, there have been headlines asserting that Queen Charlotte was Britain's first black or biracial queen. This notion arises from portraits of Charlotte painted by Alan Ramsay, which depict her with facial features that some interpret as having African influences. Additionally, her lineage has been traced back to the 13th century Portuguese king, Alfonso III, and his mistress, Madjugana, which may have been a black Moor. However, it is crucial to note that the portraits of the same subject often vary significantly and are not reliable evidence of an individual's true appearance. Furthermore, Charlotte was separated by 500 years and 15 generations, which means Charlotte's potential Moorish heritage would have been constituted less.